Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second session of our SQE virtual conference. I'm sure you're now familiar with how our webinars work, but just in case, if you have questions, please do share them with us. There's a question button on the link below this video. You can pose your questions anonymously, although it's always great to have your names. We've already had quite a lot of questions in. We'll try to get through as many as we can. It may be that some of the questions will be better addressed at the final session of today's event on QWE after lunch, and if that's the case, we will carry them forward. This stream will be available on catch up, as will the slides, links to relevant web pages, and do feel free to share those with colleagues. So the theme of this session is supporting candidates, and we're going to draw very much on what we've learned so far. And so it's great that we've got 4 speakers from Kaplan. First of all, Emma Hardy, who's the SQE's academic director, and she's going to very much look at some of the information we've had on candidate performance. We've got Lisa Coombs, who's Kaplan's Director of Psychometrics and Assessment Development, and Lisa's going to look at how candidates have performed in different practice areas. Then Tim Madison, who's Kaplan's SQE1 Academic Head, and Tim is going to look at using the SQE sample questions. And finally, Tim Allen, who's Kaplan's Head of Candidate Services. And Tim is going to take us through some of the questions that the customer services team regularly receive, in the hope of hoping to put out useful information so that candidates don't need to call Tim, although I know he's always very pleased to hear from everyone. So what have we learned so far? And I just wanted to start by addressing one factor that was raised at the end of the previous session. So we had a lot of questions coming in just at the end of the previous session, which related to candidates who had passed the LPC. And there seemed to be a bit of confusion coming through in the questions that we had about what they needed to do. So anybody who's passed the LPC and who wants to now use the SQE to qualify, I would suggest your first port of call should be the SRA's website, because you can go there and you can, in that way, secure an exemption from SQE1. You still, though, will need to do SQE2. So I hope that's helpful. We've also had a few late questions coming in from qualified lawyers. If you missed our response to some of those questions earlier, we will be doing a separate webinar for qualified lawyers. I think it's in May, so look out for that one. Okay, that's enough by way of introduction. I'm now going to invite Emma to join me, and we're going to Emma's going to share with us some of the feedback from the assessments that we hope will be useful. Emma, just to start, what can you tell us that you've seen from assessor or the psychometrician feedback that you're able to share and that would be helpful for candidates preparing?
Good morning, Julie. Good morning, everyone. So we have feedback from our psychometricians and the statistical analysis that they carry out on how candidates have performed in the exams. And we also have feedback from our solicitor assessors and markers who have marked the exams. I think it's important to remember with this feedback that we're still very much in the early days of the SQE, and that the feedback relates to the sittings that we've had already. It will, of course, be very interesting as we continue to see, as we monitor things, to see how things evolve over time. So the feedback that we have today covers things such as timing and how candidates manage their time when sitting each of the SQE1 and SQE2. We've also got feedback on resitting SQE1. We've had 3 sittings of the SQE1 to date, and so have some interesting data on candidate pass rates. And then there's a couple of pieces of more discrete feedback on the SQE2 exams from our assessors. On the area of timing, there was a question from Namika around how to best manage timing in the assessments. And as I say, I'll be sharing some insights on that.
Thanks, Emma. Well, shall we turn now then to timing? How are candidates managing their time when they're taking both SQE1 and SQE2? Are they having enough time, or are candidates running out of time? What are you seeing so far?
Well, I'm going to state the obvious here and say that, of course, the SQE is taken under exam conditions and that candidates have a restricted amount of time in which to complete the assessments. And just as a quick reminder, for SQE1, we know that it's split into FLK1 and FLK2 with 180 questions in each. And each is sat on a separate day, and the days themselves are split with a morning session and an afternoon session. The candidates have 2 hours and 33 minutes for each of those sessions of 90 questions. And if you divide all that down, they have 1.7 minutes to answer each multiple choice question. So the psychometricians have done some interesting analysis on how candidates manage their time for the FLK1 and FLK2 papers. And we've got this on some slides for you. So as we can see from slide 1, for the November and the July SQE1 sittings, we looked at the proportion of candidates who had 0 seconds recorded against any particular question. So that is where the candidates haven't had time to read the question. So here on this slide, we can see on the left the proportion of candidates who don't view a particular question, and the questions viewed in chronological order are shown along the bottom. Now, this slide shows peaks for each of the November and July sittings around the 90 question mark and the 180 question mark. And this is because, as I said a moment ago, candidates sit the exams in 2 sessions with a break mid-morning at 90 questions, and then they finish at 180 questions in the afternoon. So the highest peaks here are for the morning sessions at 90 questions for each of the July and November sittings, but this drops significantly for the afternoon sessions. So the higher peak in the morning, where candidates aren't viewing the final questions, suggests that perhaps some candidates aren't managing time quite as well as during the afternoon when the peak drops. Perhaps there's a settling in period during the morning when candidates aren't as focused on timing, and there are more instances of unanswered questions in the morning for the first 90 questions. However, I think it's definitely worth noting from this graph that the proportion of candidates who don't have time to finish either the morning or the afternoon sittings, it peaks at just, for the morning, it peaks at just over 4%. So more than 95% of candidates are reaching the end of the paper in the morning, and just under 99% of candidates are reaching the end of the afternoon session. Now, our second slide, slide 2, shows a similar story. As well as looking at candidates who had 0 against a particular question, we also looked at the number of instances where candidates had less than 10 seconds recorded against a question. So they've looked at an item for less than 10 seconds and then they've moved on. And this analysis produced a similar pattern to the previous one we saw. So again, we've got the candidates, the proportion of candidates who spent less than 10 seconds on the left-hand side and the questions along the bottom. This slide shows a much more jagged graph. So it suggests that candidates are coming to questions, taking a look, and perhaps clicking through to the next one where they're maybe not familiar with the topic or want to flag that particular question for later and don't come back to it at the end. Again, we see a repeat at the peaks at 90 and 180 for each of the sittings, with a much higher peak at 90. So it suggests that some candidates have left themselves less time at the end of the morning session to finish, whereas they seem to be managing more effectively for the afternoon sessions. But I would note that the peak at the end of the morning session of just under 7%. So just over 93% of the candidates are able to spend more than 10 seconds on any questions across the morning and afternoon sessions. So I think the message that we can take from these is that for a small number of candidates, time management doesn't seem to be as strong in the morning, and more candidates are running out of time towards the end. And this pattern repeats itself across each of the FLKs and each sitting. However, for the vast majority of candidates, they seem to be managing time well, and the indication is that time isn't an issue for them. We also look at average response times, and we haven't seen anything in the statistical analysis that suggests that people are having trouble with time. So I think our message is that candidates and training providers keep going as you are in terms of preparation on timing for the exams. Looking at time management for SQE2, we've got some useful feedback for markers in SQE2 on how candidates dealt with timing for that exam, particularly on the written stations. Naturally, candidates have indicated in their feedback that timing is tight for the assessments. And of course, we take timing into consideration whenever we're setting the exams. For the most recent October 2022 assessment window, markers said that generally speaking, there was no clear evidence that candidates were running out of time. We did, however, see some areas where candidates were perhaps less efficient with their time. And some markers reported that on the written stations, candidates used include everything, including the kitchen sink approach. Others found that some cut and pasted resources, including irrelevant resources, without relating them to the answers themselves. And that was particularly the case with legal research. And on the oral exams, the oral assessors felt that candidates had long enough, both in the preparation stage of the assessment and also long enough to make submissions to deal with the matters raised by the scenarios adequately.
Thanks so much, Emma. That was really interesting, particularly seeing those slides and seeing how it appears that candidates in the afternoon session have learned. There's a small number of candidates that didn't get to the end have learned and improved for the afternoon session. That's good to see. So can we move on then and talk a little bit about the resitters and how candidates who resat SQE1 in January just gone, how are they fared?
So the January 2023 window, that was the first SQE1 window where we had candidates who were resitting potentially some for the third time. And again, we've got some interesting statistics on the pass rates for those candidates. So if we start with slide 3, this slide, now it looks like quite a busy slide, but I think the important thing to focus on here are the colours. The slide shows the number of candidates who sat both tests for the first time and the numbers of passes and fails for either one or both of the FLK exams. So the green in the top right-hand corner indicates candidates who passed both FLK1 and FLK2, and the red indicates those who failed both FLK1 and FLK2, and 33% of candidates failed both tests. The yellow and orange dots indicate candidates who passed either one of FLK1 or FLK2. So that's our first attempt candidates, and then moving on to slide 4, that gives us data on repeating candidates. Fewer dots in here, of course, but this shows the number of candidates who were sitting one or both elements of SQE1 for the second or third time. So again, the green indicates the number of candidates who resat both parts and passed both on either their second or third attempt. And the red indicates the number of candidates who resat both and failed both on either their second or third attempt. In this instance, 71% failed both tests, which is obviously significantly more than the 33% of first time sitting candidates who failed both. And again, the yellow and orange dots indicate the number of candidates who passed either FLK1 or FLK2 on their second or third attempts. So we can see again that there are a significant number of candidates who failed both FLK1 and FLK2 on their second or third attempt. Now, this may indicate that candidates are perhaps deciding to resit the exam too soon after their first attempt, and that they haven't given themselves enough preparation time prior to resitting. And this is particularly the case where candidates have both FLKs to resit. Where candidates only had one FLK to resit, interestingly. So for 51 candidates sat just FLK1 as a second attempt with a 65% pass rate. The first attempt pass rate for that was 61.6%. and 160 candidates sat just FLK2 as a second attempt with a 60% pass rate, and the first attempt pass rate was 58.5%. So those pass rates for the second attempt candidates were slightly higher than those for the first attempt. So again, I think the key message would be to not rush your resit, particularly where you have both of the FLK papers to do. And make sure you have enough time, as I say, to prepare, and perhaps focus on the areas that I know Lisa is going to speak to shortly when she talks about performance in different practice areas.
Thanks, Emma. So that's really useful feedback that you've been able to share as a result of the extensive data analysis that you undertake. Is there anything else you want to add? For example, is there anything that comes back from feedback from the examiners who are looking at candidates at work?
Yeah, there are sort of a few points that we've had back from our solicitor assessors. In relation to professional conduct, the assessors have noted that weaker candidates, they apply general ethical values to the scenarios rather than following the code of conduct. And where candidates didn't deal with the conduct points well, they missed out issues rather than giving unethical advice or proposing sort of inappropriate conduct. So the answers were appropriate, but not necessarily complete or comprehensive. So I think that the message to take from that is that candidates should ensure that they apply the relevant elements of the code to the scenario and keep responses tied to the questions. In relation to the oral exams, the solicitor assessors that assessed advocacy noted that weaker candidates sometimes failed to grasp the type of application that they were making in the advocacy assessment due to a lack of understanding of the relevant procedure. So again, I think candidates ensuring that they're familiar with the types of procedures in the FLK that they may be tested on would be a very good idea.
Thank you, Emma. So what you've shared with us, a lot of it is good exam technique, isn't it? Manage your time well. Take time to prepare thoroughly for the assessment. Answer the question. Don't throw the kitchen sink at it. Yeah, stay focused. So thank you. Now we've had a question from Wes who was asking how those who have already passed the LPC should prepare for SQE2 and what SQE1 materials are crucial to do well in SQE2. I reminded everybody at the start, if you've done the LPC, you don't need to do SQE1, but I think the question is, you might nevertheless need to pull on SQE1 materials to get you through SQE2.
Yeah.
Can you help us there?
Sure. I mean, I think as the assessment organisation, we're not able to really advise you on training. But we do have some core materials on the website that are fundamental to understanding the assessment for both SQE1 and SQE2. We have the assessment specification for each of SQE1 and SQE2, and that sets out what you'll be tested on, the method of the assessment and the level of the assessment. And we also have the blueprint in the SQE1 assessment specification, which sets out the weighting or the percentage that different legal areas will have in the SQE1. So the percentage of the paper that they can be assessed on. And of course, we also have sample questions for SQE1 and SQE2. And I know Tim Madison is going to speak about those later.
Thanks, Emma. We do need to move on shortly, but we've had some questions in about spelling and grammar, and the questions are about how are spelling and grammatical errors dealt with when a candidate's assessment is marked.
Sure. The spelling, of course, is an issue that was highlighted in the independent reviewers report, and at present, the Pearson VUE platform on which we assess the SQE2 written assessments doesn't have a spell check function. The assessment criteria for the SQE2 written assessments refer to clear, precise, concise and acceptable language rather than correct spelling. And guidance on this is provided in the SQE2 assessment specification. So minor spelling mistakes aren't penalised, and the focus is on the assessment criteria mentioned and how spelling mistakes might impact that. So performance in each of the assessment criteria is assessed by our trained assessors, making their global professional judgments related to the required standard for the assessment. However, we understand the independent reviewer's comment, and we're investigating with Pearson VUE if and how a spell check function might be implemented, and we'll let stakeholders know more information towards the end of April.
Thank you, Emma. I hope that's helped people who've raised questions about spelling and grammar. I can just see one question's come in, which relates a bit back to something that was covered in the previous session, and that is about the SQE 2 exams. So in the previous session, Zoe explained that the oral and the written exams for SQE 2 aren't in a set order. In one session, it may be that the written exams precede the oral exams, and it could be the reverse for the other session. And as Zoe explained, that's determined really by exam test centre capacity. And there's a supplementary question asking whether oral exams will be available outside of the UK. There's no plans to provide for that at the moment. As I'm sure you know, the written assessments for both SQE1 and SQE2 can be taken internationally, but the oral assessments are only available in the UK. Okay, thank you so much, Emma. We might well come back to you with further questions later, but we do need to move on. So I'm going to invite Lisa. A reminder, Lisa is Director of Psychometrics and Assessment Development at Kaplan. And Lisa's going to tell us what we know from the data produced so far, how candidates are performing in different practice areas.
Lovely, thank you, Julie. So my name's Lisa Coombs. I am Director of Psychometrics and Assessment Development. So I've been involved with SQE from quite early on and helped design the way that both SQE1 and SQE2 look at the moment. And at the heart of that is this question about providing validation. So we want to make sure that the outcomes that we have are fair and fit for purpose and valid and reliable and tick all of the boxes that we would expect of a high stakes assessment like this. So my role within Kaplan is to basically to work on the post-test analysis and to provide some expert guidance on the evolution of the SQE in light of the evidence that we get in. We have a small team of psychometricians who provide routine analysis and write reports at the end of each of the assessment cycles on SQE1 and SQE2, and they're available online. And I would recommend, if you're interested in the psychometrics, please go and search them out, because they are really, really useful and insightful in terms of providing some information on what works and what doesn't, and what's going well and what's going less well within the assessment. So moving on, what I'm going to talk about today is very much the performance by the practice area within the assessment. With each assessment, so one of the underlying principles and processes that we work through is a thing called blueprinting. So blueprinting in itself is the process by which we split the assessment up and provide a plan to actually look at the content of the assessment itself. So it provides the outline and the range and the scope of everything that we want to assess. So there is a whole lot of work that goes into developing and designing a blueprint. And again, it's a really major source of validation for the test, is being able to show that this process has been done and done properly. So one of the ways that we then work and investigate the validation of the test and look at what our outcomes are is by grouping the areas together based on those blueprints, so based on those common themes, and analysing them together to look at the relative performance and the peaks and the troughs within each of those groups. So as I say, after every assessment, we publish information, and we do that for both SQE1 and SQE2. So those reports are freely available online and show you a breakdown of the different areas within each test, and that gives you an idea of how each assessment is broken up. So you can also find that in the assessment specifications. There are details on how we group together the themes and the range and the scope of the assessment. So there's already quite a lot of information there that can tell you what's included, and by implication what's not included within each of these assessments. So what we're going to do today, what this session is going to be about, is just really looking at some of the different assessments. So we'll look at each assessment in turn and see what we can take away from the assessments that we've got. So the first one that we're going to look at is SQE1 and FLK1. So here's a slide that just in a nutshell explains what we see in that. So what we see is we see high scores in ethics. This is something which we will come back to again and again as I go through these slides. We see really good scores in ethics questions. There are fewer ethics questions within each assessment than there are for the other areas, but part of that is because the questions are what we would call single classification questions, so that the classifications are only aligned in one area of the blueprint, when in some cases they take more than one area in. So for the questions that we group together and define as ethics, we see very high scores. So you can see for the two FLKs that I'm going to talk about today, we've seen 69% and 73.4% in FLK1. This analysis, I'm just going to say, so all this analysis comes from the annual report, which has just recently been published. So there is a much more detailed write-up and a breakdown of the performance by practice area there for all of the assessments over the last year. The other area that did really well was contract law, and again, sort of 65.5% and 70%. So just to give you some sort of idea of how that relates up, our pass marks have been around the 56-57% mark so far. So you can see that those are scores that are easily beating the pass mark for the assessments. Where that's lower has been so far in business law and practice, where we saw on the first FLK1 of the year, we saw 49.6% and 58.5% on the second one. So these are the mean scores. And in dispute resolution, where we had 52.6 and 55.8%. So those are obviously around or lower than the pass mark. So it doesn't take a lot to work out that these are areas that could be improved. And because these are averages, that's so on average more than 50% of the cohort are within each assessment are scoring below the pass mark within those areas. Now there'll be 25, 30, 35 questions within each of those groups, so it's a relatively small sample compared to the whole test, but it's still a good sample to tell us a little bit about that. So moving on, we can see that the plots here, and these are directly from the annual report. This shows you the passing and failing scores for each of the groups and for each of the assessments and for each of those areas. So you can see on the left hand side is ethics. They are ordered in the same direction. So in on the left hand side there for November 2021, you can see ethics is the highest score, then contract law. That's repeated on the right hand side. The bars there, the lower bar relates to the failing candidates and the slightly higher bar relates to the passing candidates. So you can see, I mean, it's naturally those people who are passing get higher scores within each of these areas than the people who are failing the assessments. It's interesting to note that the pass and fail here follows the same pattern, so we get the same highs and lows within each group. The business law and practice scores particularly dropped for the FLK1 in July 2022. In some of these cases, this is a function of how easy or difficult the relative assessments are and the questions within that area. So although we aim to have assessments that are of a certain difficulty, there will be some variation in that. What you can see there is that there is some variance in the difficulty, and the bars go up and down to relate to that. But broadly speaking, we see a fairly similar pattern with FLK1 and for FLK1 in November and in July, with sort of ethics and contract law at the higher end of that scale. So when we move on, we also have this exact same analysis for FLK2. And as I just said, we're going to come back to ethics, and ethics again has a really good score here, 65.1 and 74.8% in the two FLK2s that we're covering today. Criminal liability has also been quite good for its scoring, and that was 58.8 and 71, so that's actually increased quite a lot from the November to the July test. Much lower scores here as well for property practice and for wills and intestacy. Property practice in particular, 46.4 and 48.3, and those are the average scores. And again, for FLK2, we've seen pass marks around the sort of 55-56% mark. So there, again, as a comparison, you can see that those scores are well below the pass mark in most cases. The property practice in particular has been consistent and been quite low, and again that may be due to having slightly tougher questions, and something which we'll come on to as a conclusion at the end is that we're still very much building a picture of what the data looks like here, and that will improve over time as we get more and more tests through. So if we have a look at the plots for FLK2, you can see fairly similar sort of pattern to the last one. Interestingly, for FLK2 in November 2021, criminal liability was the highest scoring area and not ethics. That seems to have been an exception rather than the rule, and you can see in the July test that ethics is the highest scoring of those areas. You can also see the difference with criminal law and practice on the right hand side of both of those plots, where there was an increase for July. Again, the pass rates that we've seen on FLK2 have been slightly lower than they have been for FLK1. And again, some of that can reflect the difficulty of the assessment and the part of the role that we do is in like I say, looking at each of these aspects to make sure that there's nothing about the assessment that is directly causing that. So again, I think we're relatively reassured that the test based on this is performing the way that we want it to. We're getting a spread of scores. We're seeing the highs and the lows here roughly mirror each other, but not exactly. The passing and the failing candidates as well are doing well in the same areas and not doing well in others, although again you have that difference between what their scores are showing. So when we look at SQE2, and we've just got the one SQE2 in the annual report, which is for April 22. So if we can move on. Oops, my apologies. We've got the quintile plots first. So the SQE1 quintile plots, these are taken from the post-test assessments for each individual assessment. So at the end of every assessment, we publish a short report. And this shows you a little bit on the spread of scores that we see. So that gives you an idea of where the scores are. So each of those bars represents 20% of the cohort. So I just wanted to draw attention to these and the fact that they're available, because they tell you something about not just the mean score, but the distribution of scores within each area. So on the top right hand side there, you can see ethics, and there are only 4 bars showing there, but because more than 20% of people get the highest sort of scores there. So for most of those, you can see that we have a big long tail on the left hand side, where we get some people tailing towards the lower end of the scores, but most of those scores are kind of compressed in the middle with a higher range on the right hand side. So like I say, that's the performance of each of the groups based on their total score, and we just split them into 5 groups and have a look at how each of those groups performed in each area. So again, useful to tell you which areas are performing well and which areas are performing less well on these on these areas. And again, from my point of view, it's all stuff that contributes positively towards the validation processes that we go through. Okay, so if we can move on, we've got SQE2 now. So for SQE2, we have only one assessment, which I'm going to cover today, which is the one that's been in the annual report as well. SQE2, there are 16 stations, and a station is a discrete piece of assessment. So the reason that we have 16 here is that each one provides a little insight into someone's abilities and their competencies. And so with 16 little pictures, we hopefully form a better picture of whether someone is competent or not. We cover a high range of skills and practice areas within that. And within that, when we look at where those performances have done really well, legal research, dispute resolution, 85%, that's a really, really good score there. Advocacy in criminal litigations next with 78.5. Case and matter analysis for business was 78.3. Again, all really, really good scores. 9 of the 16 stations that we had scored 70% or above, and that included all 4 oral stations. So again, as you would expect, although they're testing the competency generally, there is going to be some differences between performance across all of these areas, but that's again really consistently good. The lowest mean score was legal writing and dispute resolution, which was at 57%. That was the only mean score that we saw that was below 60% there. So if we have a look at how that looks in the plots, so here we can see the written stations. So we have 12 written stations. Now, compared to what we see in FLK1, the interesting thing for me, and as you know, as a data nerd here, it's the fact that the passes and the fails don't necessarily follow each other and don't necessarily mirror each other here. For example, the high scores in for failing in the legal writing and business, low scores for passing in legal dispute resolution. There's some variation here. There's probably a really good explanation of that to do with how each of the questions is contributing and how each of them are discriminating. So when we do the analysis, we look at how discriminating all of the assessment is and come back with some really good values on that. But it's still quite early days, and you know, we take this data and we feed that back to the people who create and work on the stations and use that to improve what we do. So if we can move on to the oral stations, we have 4 oral stations, and as I said, the scores here were really, really good. And again, not a huge amount to add on that. It is less obvious because of the size of the plot here compared to the other one, but it kind of does the same. So the pattern between high and low scores for the passing and failing candidates does not necessarily mirror each other in the right way, in the same way that it does for the MCQ assessment. So if we can move on, what we find, and so the mean scores and the score performance is a bit more variable, but there are lots of contributing factors to SQE2. There are only 16 sort of points of data that we record on each person, so 16 station scores that we record. There's lots of contributing factors that contribute to the score variance. So the station contributes, the candidates contribute, how each candidate works within each station contributes. The increase in variance is interesting, but the design of the assessment is there to make sure that we have a safety net and can basically say that people are competent based on the information that we get. So it's interesting and something that we'll monitor going forwards, but that's about it for now. It could be down to the variance in the station discrimination, but with fewer pieces of data than SQE1, it's hard to tell at the moment. So if we can go on again, we also have quintile plots. So this is just one for sitting one. I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's just to point out that these are there as well and available in the post-test reports. And again, you can see the distributions within each of the station areas. So just some quick conclusions. The detailed analysis we have is all available post-test and hopefully provides a bit of insight into which areas are performing and which are not. We haven't yet reached a steady state. So as Emma said, we are still getting people who are passing and failing within the system. So we are having resitters for the first time entering the system, and the numbers change a little bit. But hopefully this information helps guide a little bit of revision practice and shows a way of measuring the effectiveness of our interventions. And for myself as a psychometrician, the thing that I'm looking forward to is more tests mean more data. It means more work for me, but it also means stronger interpretations, and hopefully we'll be able to provide better feedback and better analysis to share with everyone out there. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lisa, a self-confessed data nerd who I know gets very excited with every assessment that's taken. And as she has said, the more candidates who make more tests, the more data there is, the richer the data set we will have, and yeah, the more meaningful the conclusions we'll be able to draw from it. So lots on the slides. We've been having some questions coming through about how people can access the slides. Everybody who's registered to attend this event will be sent a link to the slides, which will be on our website after the event. So we will email everybody who's registered a link to take them straight to those slides. Before I move on, Lisa, there've been, and you might not be the best person to answer these, but there's been some questions about student anxiety. And somebody has suggested that it's a high stakes test. Absolutely. Candidates find it stressful. I'm afraid many will. But for those who have a particular mental health issue, such as anxiety, there's a question as to whether we know if such candidates are faring less well in the assessments. Now, my understanding is, although we have data which captures whether a candidate has declared a disability, we won't know the nature of the disability that they have. Is that right, Lisa? Is there anything you can add to that?
Yes, so we routinely have a look at the demographics across a wide range of different and self-declared identifications. So one of those things that we ask people about is if they have a disability, and we do ask them to describe what that disability might be. Again, it's self-described, and I think that the question that we ask during the survey is whether someone has a disability as defined by the Equality Act. The analysis that we do generally just looks at the people who have declared a disability against those who have not. But again, as we get more data, we'll be able to look at that. I think the numbers are relatively small for some of these groups at the moment, and certainly it would be on our radar to look at those kind of specific questions as we move on and as we can pull more data together.
Thanks, Tim.
I should just say as well, we publish pass rates as well, so the post-test reports will include the pass rates for each of those groups, so those declaring a disability and those who do not.
Thanks, Lisa. As I said in the earlier session, I think what the pass rates are showing that for candidates who've declared a disability in some of the assessments have performed better than those who haven't, been that's been reversed in other assessments. So again, something that we will be watching closely. There have been other questions about what arrangements are made for candidates, for example, who have dyslexia. There's again a lot of information on the website on this. Kaplan do have a team that's available to support anybody who has a disability, including neurodiversity, issues that might affect the way in which they will perform in the assessments. The plea from Kaplan always to such candidates is to contact Kaplan, contact them early, so that the best adjustments that can be made for that candidate can be considered and put in place. But time really is essential for Kaplan to engage with the individual candidate, because what there isn't is a one-size-fits-all approach for all candidates, and there's a range of accommodations that can be used, for example, for candidates with dyslexia. Okay, we do need to move on, so thank you so much, Lisa, and I know that your slides are going to be poured over by everybody who's been with us this morning, and we might well come back to you with further questions. Thank you. But we're going to move on now to Tim, who, as I said at the start, is Kaplan's SQE1 academic head. Tim is going to talk about using the SQE sample questions, and there have been a lot of questions coming in from those who have joined us this morning about the sample questions and questions about the availability of past papers and the like. So Tim, I think it's likely that you will be probably covering off a lot of those questions, but I'm going to hand over to you to tell us how candidates should be using the sample questions that have been published. Thank you.
I think we've got the wrong Tim on screen. You want Tim Madison at this point.
That's better. That's the right Tim. Too many Tims. Good. Just about good morning, everyone. As Julie said, my name is Tim Madison. I'm the academic head for SQE1 at Kaplan, and I'm here to talk to you about using the SQE sample questions. In terms of what I'm going to cover, of course, the focus is going to be on using the SQE sample questions. There's going to be more of a focus on the SQE1 sample questions than the SQE2 sample questions. The reason for that is not just because I'm the academic head for SQE1. It's more focused on the fact that we have received more feedback from candidates on the SQE1 sample questions, and so we thought it was right to spend a bit more time on the SQE1 questions to address that. And as Julie's mentioned as well, we've had a couple of questions in as well, so hopefully as I go through my session, that will address some of the questions that have been raised, and I will touch on past papers at the end as well. Before I launch in and really focus on the sample questions, to add some context, which I think will be useful before I do talk about the sample questions, I will be talking briefly about our question writing process for SQE1, and also very briefly looking at the anatomy of a typical SQE1 question. We have looked at that on previous conferences and updates, but I'm well aware that the audience here will comprise training providers that will be familiar with a lot of this, but will also comprise candidates that will find this useful as well. So I'll kick off by starting with our question writing process and just briefly take you through what that actually involves. The first thing to point out is that everyone involved in our SQE1 question writing process is a qualified solicitor. And the various people that I talk about in a moment, they are all qualified solicitors. And so where does a question start? Well, the question starts obviously by being drafted, and it's drafted by a subject matter expert. And a lot of work goes into that initial draft. Within some parameters. So whenever our subject matter experts are drafting questions, they of course have to make sure that the topic they're drafting on falls within our FLK, the functioning legal knowledge, and also in terms of the level at which it's drafted at, that it's drafted at the level of a day one newly qualified solicitor as well. And then once that's been drafted, it is then reviewed by at least one other subject matter expert. The main focus of that is, of course, to check the law, but also to review the question as well. And then following that review, we then have further review by at least one experienced SQE1 question writer. So not necessarily checking the law here, but more the structure and the validity of the question and consistency as against other questions as well. And once that's taken place, the question is going to be in very good shape. It comes to me as academic head for final approval before it enters our question bank. There may well be further discussion with the subject matter expert who drafted the question before it enters into the question bank. And once it's in the question bank, it is then available for use in one of our assessments. The process doesn't stop there, though. Before each assessment, our subject experts, our subject heads within the Kaplan SQE team select some questions that we may use in the assessment. So by doing so, they will be looking at those questions again. I will review all of the questions that go into an assessment, and we also have a separate review process where a different academic team within Kaplan SQE who haven't been involved with the question drafting at all review the entire paper as well. There is further review. We have an ANGOF panel that sits twice a year. Any question that enters a assessment will have been before an ANGOF panel. And for those that aren't familiar with an ANGOF panel, this is a panel that is put together of up to 15 qualified solicitors. We ensure that that panel is varied in terms of background, practice area and experience, and we have a minimum number of solicitors between 0 and 2 years post-qualified experience. To ensure that we are very much focusing and making sure we're hitting that day one threshold. The ANGOF panel review the questions and they also rate the questions difficulty, and that in turn helps us and Lisa specifically to set the pass mark for the assessment. There's also a further review of the questions before they enter assessments. So the SRA's subject matter experts will review a selection of the assessment questions and provide any comments that they may have before they enter an assessment. And then finally, we have a sort of a wider review process. We have an annual review process. We review all questions separately after they've been through an assessment. And of course, as often happens when there's a change in the law, we undertake a review of those questions that are affected by that change in the law. So hopefully that sets the scene and really shows that we do have a very thorough and rigorous process in drafting and approving and reviewing our SQE1 questions. I also said I would have a look at the anatomy of a question, and again, I don't intend to spend a lot of time on this, but will be certainly useful to have a look at. This is one of the questions that we have as part of our SQE1 sample pack, and really what I wanted to do is just draw your attention to the 3 key component parts to one of our SQE1 questions. So you'll see at the start of the question here, we have 3 paragraphs. This is what we call the stem, and the stem is essentially the fact pattern or the story of the question. And it contains all of the information that a candidate needs to answer the question. And we will always endeavour to keep the length of the stem and indeed the rest of the question to the minimum number of words that are required to test the particular point. Another important point to mention in relation to the stem is that there's no need for candidates to make any assumptions or any inferences. All of the information and facts required to answer the question are contained in that stem. We then go through to the second component part of our question, which is the lead-in. You can see that in bold there. And this really is just the question that needs to be answered by the candidate. And we very much aim to keep this as short and concise as possible. And then we move through to our options. So you'll see that an SQE1 question has 5 options for candidates to choose from. Only one of those options is the correct answer. We also have 4 plausible, what we call distractor options. And the final thing to note in relation to these questions and the options in particular is that we don't introduce any new facts in the options. Going back to the point I raised earlier, all of the facts needed to answer the question are in the STEM. So hopefully that set the context. And what I would like to do now is focus a bit more on the sample questions. And as I mentioned at the start there, really focus on our SQE1 sample questions. So first of all, where would you find the SQE1 sample questions for candidates that are thinking of taking the SQE? There's a link at the bottom of that slide, and Julie mentioned that you will have access to those slides, which takes you through to that. But equally, it's really straightforward to find. If you were to go onto the SQE1 assessment specification, there's a couple of links that take you directly to the SQE1 sample questions. We have 90 SQE1 sample questions, and they are split. So we have 45 sample questions that cover FLK1 and 45 sample questions that cover FLK2. Now, it is the assessment specification and the FLK that sets out what can be tested on. The sample questions, the purpose of the sample questions set out in that second bullet point there, is really to show how we might ask a question in relation to some of the areas on the FLK. So to give an indication of the kind of questions that appear on the FLK1 and FLK2 SQE1 assessments. In terms of some guidance then around what the sample questions do and don't do, firstly, in terms of what the sample questions do, the sample questions do follow the same style as the SQE1 assessment questions. The reason I say that is because they're drafted and reviewed in exactly the same way as the process for drafting and reviewing our assessment questions, which was a reason why I talked through that at the beginning of this session. There is a difference, though, between the assessment questions and the sample questions in that the sample questions do come with answers. So we do tell you which is the correct option to choose. But back to the similarities between the assessment questions and the samples, they both contain a mixture of question length. So the sample questions are very much representative of the different types of question length that you or a candidate may come across in the actual assessment. And just to show you just a couple of examples, these again are taken from our sample question pack. The first question you can see there, albeit we've blown it up to fit the slide. This is a relatively short question. So this is the STEM, you can see has 1 paragraph, and you can see the options there are between 1 and 3 words. And then another question, which again forms part of our sample question pack here. You can see this is a much longer question. We've got 4 paragraphs there in the STEM, and the options you can see there are a little bit longer as well. And within our sample questions, we do have lots of short questions, some long questions and questions in between as well, again, to try and be representative as to what a candidate would come across in the assessment. I am often asked the question that, why are some questions longer than others and why can't we keep them the same length? The answer to that is that some areas of the FLK and some topics within areas of the FLK, do naturally require a more detailed set of facts to be able to test that specific point. So we do have questions that differ in length for that reason, but as I mentioned at the beginning, we do very much as part of our question writing process aim to keep the length of the question to the minimum required to test the point. What do the sample questions not do then? Well, first of all, the sample questions don't cover the entirety of the FLK. The FLK, many of you will be familiar with, is large. It covers all of our subjects and bullet points under each one of those. As I've mentioned, the sample questions, 45 cover FLK1 and 45 cover FLK2. But in the same way as the sample questions don't cross or cover the entirety of the FLK. Neither does an SQE1 assessment. We of course make sure we're testing across the FLK, but it wouldn't be possible to test the entirety of the FLK in an SQE1 assessment. Secondly, what the sample questions don't do is replicate sitting the SQE1. That can be a different experience. I know some of this has been covered already, so I'll move through quite quickly, but the SQE1 itself comprises 360 questions sat over 2 days. We know that we've got, well, candidates have approximately 1.7 minutes to answer a question. It's in a closed book environment and actually on the Pearson VUE system as well. So the questions on the Pearson VUE system can look a little bit different to the questions, the sample questions, when looking at those on screen or on a PDF. But on that last bullet there, we do have a demo site where candidates can log in and have a look at 18 of our sample questions in the Pearson VUE platform. So it's possible to have a look at that in advance to help with that adjustment. So then just to focus on a couple of specific areas of feedback that we've received. They are that the sample questions for SQE1 are either easier or shorter than the questions that candidates face in the assessment. So we're going to deal with both of those and show you that we have done quite a significant amount of work in the background to establish whether this is the case or not. So to put this into context, we've had 3 sits so far of SQE1. After every sit, we send the candidates a survey to complete, and between 10 to 12% of the responses to the survey have raised one or both of those issues. So dealing with the first issue, are the sample questions easier? Well, if I go back to my point about our question writing process, we very much do set our questions, all of our questions, at the level of a day 1 newly qualified solicitor. Secondly, I've talked about the ANGOF panel already, and what one of their jobs is to assess the difficulty of the questions and in turn help set pass marks. One point to mention here is that pass marks can change between FLK1 and FLK2 in one assessment window, and can change between different windows as well. And that very much depends on the questions that have been selected for a particular sit or a particular paper. So a paper can be more difficult or less difficult, but the pass mark is adjusted to help with that. And so the ANGOF panel, whilst they review all questions that go into the assessment, they also review our sample questions as well. Our ANGOF panel sits every 6 months, and we always, every panel, put forward a selection of sample questions to the panel for them to look at alongside. And what I would say is that the result of that is that the ANGOF scores, so the difficulty scores for the sample questions, are very, very much in line with the scores that we see in relation to our assessment questions. So there's no noticeable difference there. To add to that, the SRA's own subject matter experts review our sample questions in the same way that they review our assessment questions. And part of that review, they do check that the sample questions are in line with how we're assessing in the assessment for obvious reasons. And just a couple of bits of feedback in relation to that specific point from the SRA subject matter experts is that the sample questions are of equal academic rigor to the assessment questions, and that they saw no discernible differences in difficulty, or layout between the sample questions and the assessment questions themselves. And then if we move to having a look at the other piece of feedback, which is that the sample questions are shorter than the assessment questions. Well, I've already mentioned that the sample questions do have a range of question length. We do have some short ones, some medium length ones, and some longer ones to provide that variety. And I've also mentioned that there are areas of the FLK, and some of those that might not be covered by the sample questions, that naturally require longer stems or options to enable us to test that specific point as well. So what are we doing in relation to the feedback. Obviously, a lot of work has gone in to looking at the feedback and seeing if the questions were easier or longer, and I've given you the results of that, but we haven't stopped there, and we do want to do everything we can to help candidates in this regard. So we have amended the guidance on the sample questions webpage, so that's up there in live at the moment. So that's very much in accordance with this guidance I've set out today. We've also amended the order of the sample questions in terms of how they appear. And the reason we've done that is because we analysed the website viewing data for the sample questions page, and specifically in relation to each of the 90 sample questions. And we did that over a 12-month period in 2022. And what we saw is that, and I can give you just a couple of examples, that the views per question decreased over time. So at its peak last year, so shortly before the July 22 SQE1 assessment, the first sample question had, over the course of a week, 818 views. The second had 560 views, and the third had 418 views. And the pattern continued all the way through in the same vein until you get to the question 90. So what that showed us is that some candidates, anyway, are really kind of looking at the first few and less are kind of following that review through to the end. And so what we've done to help with candidates that are only looking at the first maybe 5 or 10 is just to reorder the order of our sample questions, so that we actually do, even within that first 10 sample questions, have that mixture of the different question lengths and types to help with that. Emma, my colleague Emma Hardy, talked in detail about the candidate timing statistics. So again, in the event that the assessment questions were much more difficult and longer, naturally we would like to look at the data on how long it's taken candidates to answer those questions to see if that's causing an issue. And Emma's gone through that in quite a lot of detail to establish that, generally speaking, candidates are managing their time very well in the assessment. I'm going to just quickly pause because there's a couple of questions coming in about the multiple choice questions, and just to really just go over the point I made when looking at the anatomy of a question, and just to be really clear, for the multiple choice questions there is only one correct answer, because we have had a couple of questions that have come in on that. And finally, then, the final bullet point on this slide is that we do review our sample questions again in the same way as we review our assessment questions. And so insofar as we see perhaps the style of our questions changing or the way we paragraph questions, we would make the same changes to our sample questions as well to make them reflective of that as well. Okay, so I've spent the majority of the session talking to you about SQE1 sample questions. I did promise I would touch on the SQE2 sample questions, which I'm going to do now. So the SQE2 sample questions, you can find them almost in the same place as the SQE1 sample questions. There's a link at the bottom of the slide there, but again, you can just go through the assessment specification for SQE2, and there's links to the sample questions there. The purpose is similar, really, to the SQE1 sample questions. The idea is to give candidates and training providers an indication of the content, the format, the level, the breadth that candidates might face in the assessment of our SQE2 questions. We do have sample questions for each of those 4 SQE2 written stations, and also the 2 oral SQE2 stations as well. In terms of what they comprise, the idea is that we give the candidates what they would get in the actual assessment. So it has the introduction to candidates, some supplementary documentation if that's relevant. So that might be a witness statement, for example, or some official copies, depending on the practice area being assessed. And we also provide the relevant assessment criteria as well. In addition to that, in addition to what candidates would get in the assessment, we then provide some points to note. So that's really detailing the key legal points that we'd be expecting candidates to pick up on in relation to the particular sample scenario. And then we provide some sample answers. So at least 1, but usually 2 sample answers per sample question. And again, we've had some feedback as to, what the purpose is of those sample answers. And so those sample answers are designed to imitate potentially what candidates would submit. So they are not the perfect model answer, and I'll address why that's the case in a moment. But we do then provide suggestions as to how, if a candidate did produce a submission similar to one of our sample answers, how a candidate may go about strengthening and improving that particular answer. And I said we don't provide that model answer, that perfect answer, for the main reason that we very much appreciate that in practice, and of course with candidates, will take different approaches to how they might draft something, for example. And so we very much appreciate those different styles and approaches, and we didn't want to impose our own style and approach and give candidates the impression that's the only way to approach a particular task. That's not the case at all. So that, I think, fills the time that I was given to run this session. Before I finish, though, if I've got time, I just did want to address one question that came up on a couple of occasions from the audience, and that was as to whether or not we have any plans to provide any further sample questions in either SQE1 or SQE2, or provide any past papers. And the answer to that at the moment is that there are no immediate plans to do so. We're well aware that some professional assessment organisations do provide more than we do. Some professional assessment organisations provide something similar to what we do, and indeed some provide less than we do as well. I'm very much hoping that the guidance and assurances that we've been able to provide today and the improved guidance on the SRA SQE website is going to help as well. But of course, we always keep everything we do under review, so it's not something that we wouldn't come back and look at in the future. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Tim. I'm sure everybody found that presentation really insightful. And I hope participants are reassured that a really thorough analysis has been undertaken to consider the feedback that we have heard from some candidates. But as Tim said, it does seem to be, a relatively small minority of candidates who feedback that the sample questions aren't representative of the questions that actually appear, or the analysis suggests that they indeed are. So thanks, Tim. We may come back to you at the end with some further questions if more come in. But I'm now going to move on to other Tim, Tim Allen. Thank you, Tim, for waiting patiently for us. So Tim is Head of Candidate Services, and so it's really at the front of Kaplan's engagement with candidates in the lead up to the exam on results days and sometimes afterwards. So Tim, can you tell us about one of the most common questions that you get asked by candidates, perhaps, just to set the scene?
Okay, yeah, good afternoon, Julian. Good afternoon, everybody. It is the other Tim now. One of the most common questions is around dates, and probably something I'll probably reinforce throughout my short presentation is that probably 9 out of 10 questions that come into candidate services are answerable on the sqe.sra.org.uk website. So just to kind of emphasize that first, and because all of the dates that I'm talking about, the booking window opening and closing are on the website, and they're in an easy to read table format, but it appears to be a point of confusion at times. We add new dates constantly to the website, and each time we do flag them in SQE News, which is constantly updated.
Thank you, Tim. And I think some dates have recently been added to the website for next year's assessments. And actually, going back to one of the earlier questions, which was about anxiety, student anxiety, it might be worth noting that from 2024, there will be a wider gap between FRK1 and FRK2 for the SQE1 assessment, which might suit some students better. I know some candidates would prefer to get it all out of the way quickly, but thank you. So perhaps we could go through the sort of candidate journey, starting with the pre-booking stage, so the stage before a candidate takes the assessment. What sorts of issues do you deal with? What gets raised? What questions do candidates put to you, Tim?
Okay. Regarding pre-booking, probably timing is a key area that is asked of us. Candidates ask us about when they should complete their pre-booking steps. And of course, the answer there is that they should complete that in advance of the booking window opening. Leaving pre-booking to the booking opening day can create unnecessary delay when steps aren't completed, and they then need to reach out to us to support on pre-booking steps when in fact they would like to be booking at that time. So that I would say make sure and do pre-booking steps well in advance of a booking window opening. For each booking, we ask for the pre-booking steps to be completed. So that's a very common question and a point of confusion. So the pre-booking steps do need to be completed for each assessment. And also, for any reason, if an exemption, for example, or a reasonable adjustment needs to be added or removed kind of late in the process, it might be needed that we reset the account. And again, that will cause confusion and delays. So it's something you need to talk to candidate services about, but again, something that's best done before the booking window actually opens. We're frequently asked about the ID verification process, and that can take up to 3 days to actually go through the system. Candidates should always check that their ID has been verified well in advance of a booking window opening, which then allows us to support if something has gone wrong or if the ID hasn't verified.
Thanks, Tim. So that's pre-booking. How about questions about the reasonable adjustment arrangements? We've touched on that briefly. I stress the importance of candidates who need a reasonable adjustment making early contact with Kaplan. Is that your experience? Do candidates reach out early? How does it work?
The vast majority of candidates are thankfully approaching us well in advance, although we do get questions on the day of a booking window, which again causes unnecessary anxiety and delay for those candidates. And so again, the theme is very much about planning ahead, reaching out to us in advance, especially in the area of reasonable adjustments. So we can answer general questions about reasonable adjustments within candidate services, but if it's something very specific to somebody's exact needs, those would be answered by our colleagues in the Equality and Quality team. We're frequently asked whether somebody with reasonable adjustments should be booking online, and that's a major confusion, I would say. The Equality and Quality team are there to manage their booking for them, and so we should never be in a situation where somebody who has reasonable adjustments is having to book online on the first day of a booking window. This is mentioned in the pre-booking steps, and it's on the RA web pages on the website. The Equality and Quality team support RA candidates right through the process. They will be supporting they will be sourcing the seat. They will be ensuring that the appropriate test centre is found, which can accommodate the very specific adjustments agreed for those particular candidates. If an RA candidate goes ahead and books online with their own seat, that ultimately complicates the process, and ultimately that seat has to be cancelled and the process almost started again. But as I would emphasise, RA candidates do not need to book online. They need to be communicating well in advance with their Equality and Quality team, who will support them with the booking process.
Thanks, Tim. That's helpful. And that's very much so that the Equality and Quality team can make sure that the candidate is allocated to the centre that can best make the reasonable adjustment that's agreed, as I understand it.
Indeed.
So really important to follow that process. Thank you. So how about payment and cancellations? Do you get many questions about payment and cancellations?
Yes, particularly around timing, the fees themselves and the process for making cancellations. Regarding timing, credit agreements and vouchers are often requested on or just before a booking window opens. Now, a credit agreement itself can take 2 to 3 weeks due to the corporate checks that are required behind the scenes. Vouchers potentially take 3 days to actually be created by the finance team. And there's a whole table on the website which explains when vouchers can be purchased. But of course, it's best to carry out these things well in advance so that the finances are in place well before a booking window opens. Late applications can ultimately impact the chances of a candidate actually booking in the window. Regarding fees, the fees are very clear on the website. But again, that's often a regular question that training providers have with us. Costs and fees is the heading on the website. It's very clearly laid out the costs of the individual assessments. Cancellations. We frequently have to remind candidates that cancellations need to be given in writing via email, and that comes directly from the candidate themselves. There's also been confusion when a candidate agrees deferring training with a training provider. They also sometimes become confused that actually that deferment has somehow impacted their assessment as well, i.e. there's been a communication that the training provider has also deferred the assessment, which isn't the case. So if a candidate is deferring their training, they should also be talking to us about deferring their actual assessment. Invariably, what that means is the assessment has to be cancelled and then rebooked at a later date.
Thanks, Tim. I mean, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that particular confusion that candidates thought if they deferred their training, they'd automatically deferred their assessment. An important message, I think, for training providers who are with us today to take away, so that if they do get anybody who is deferring their training, to remind them, please, to deal separately with Kaplan to sort out their assessment date. Tim, how about on the day of assessment? Do you get many questions from candidates on the assessment, or are they too busy doing the assessment?
It's probably the main questions on the actual day of an assessment around where is my assessment, and we ironically have to spend a lot of time on Google Maps trying to almost point candidates in the right direction, and therefore some good pre-planning there will be helpful, with one, referring to the booking instructions to make sure a candidate is very clear on the address they're heading to, and we often do have candidates doing kind of dummy runs as well to make sure they understand ahead of their assessment centre assessment where exactly they are going to. But we do find ourselves pointing people in the right directions on the actual day. We are also asked about ID, often very late in the process, the night before an assessment, or even on the morning itself. So again, there's plenty of information about which correct IDs should be being used for the assessments, again on the website. Probably the reoccurring themes, I would say, is that planning ahead reduces anxiety, you know, on the day, and as we head up to the assessments. There's a huge amount of information. I'll repeat it again, the sque.sra.org.uk website is the font of all truth. It's got all of the information on there. So a referral to that will invariably have the answer. But again, the third point I'd make is candidate services are always there to help people if you need us.
Thanks, Tim. The thought of getting lost on the way to a test centre just leaves me cold. Oh my gosh. Oh, I've got anxiety just thinking about that situation. How awful. Yes, plan ahead. Tim, in the previous session, I don't know if you were listening in, we had some questions about when the booking window opens and how candidates should set about joining the system to book their place, and how queuing works. Is there anything that you can say, perhaps from your experience of the questions you were receiving yesterday, about that?
Candidates often come onto the site very early in the morning and feeling as though they're going to get some gain by joining at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning when the booking window opens at 10 o'clock in the morning. In reality, the places within the queue are randomly allocated. In essence, everybody within the site goes into a waiting room exactly at 10 o'clock in the morning when a booking window opens, and then places are randomly allocated within the queue for the queue to start. So there's ultimate fairness. Everybody's treated exactly the same. There's no kind of queue jumping. And then the booking window will open, and the system will be allocated and will be informing each individual of where they are in the queue and how long the queue is open, as what the waiting time is. So the information is there, and whilst everyone can get anxious about waiting for such things, invariably there is very little somebody can do apart from waiting until they ultimately come through the queue to come onto the site. But the key thing is to have everything done before you reach that point in time. Because unfortunately, we then get calls to say, well, actually, I haven't completed my my ID. I'm now confused as to what sites I should be sitting and when the dates are and all of those kind of good things. So it is all a matter of pre-planning and thinking ahead to think, have I done everything on my account so that I'm just ready to book as soon as I can. I come out of that queuing system.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks so much. And for anybody who wasn't on the earlier session, we were getting questions coming through that suggested that there were no places left for SQE1 in July. That's absolutely not the case. There are places, including lots of places in London. So thank you, Tim. Right. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Tim? Any other nuggets that you could share, or should we open the questions more widely to?
No, I just mentioned with the seat booking, we're continuing to talk to Pearson VUE about seat availability and opening more seats. So just keep an eye on the website. If you have a booking that may be at an inconvenient spot, for example, there's that opportunity to reschedule or change your seat right up until the end of the booking window, which closes on the 30th of May. So there's a lot of time still to look for alternative seats and reschedule the booking if somebody wants to.
Thanks, Tim. And sorry, before I allow you to take a breath, a question has just popped up, which is asking whether it's possible for a candidate's workplace to pay the exam fees via an invoice, or is it easier for the candidate to make the payment and claim the money back from their employer as an expense?
What I would say, at the end of the day, it's an online booking system, and the payment needs to be made at the point of booking. And so therefore, if you start separating the two, it creates delay and there's a chance that the place could be lost. So if the candidate could, a voucher can be bought up front, for example, or a company credit card can be used at the point of booking. It's thinking about what allows the candidate to book and pay right at the when the booking window opens, and that's the thing that will make the most successful booking. If we put more administration in place, if money has to be claimed back, etc., it potentially threatens the booking. So whatever you can do to help the candidate book and pay quickly, and if that means they have a company credit card or have to use their own credit card, it will give them a very fast way of paying and booking as soon as the window opens.
Thanks, Tim. That's really clear and helpful. Okay, we've got a few more questions that we haven't yet addressed. So could I ask the all other colleagues to join me for this final session, please? Thank you. I'm going to start with one for Emma. A couple of questions have come in. I don't know whether it's the same person who's asking the same question in a similar way, or whether for some reason a couple of people are asking a very similar question. It's about what law needs to be drawn upon in the Wills assessment. Can you help us there, Emma, please?
Sure. So the SQE2 assessment specification sets out for each of our 5 practice areas, of which Wills is one, the underlying black letter law that might be drawn on from the FLK. And for Wills and probate, the underlying black letter law is trusts. And then I think there was a similar question in relation to dispute resolution. And for that, the underlying black letter law is contract and tort. But as I say, it's nice and clearly set out in a list at the top of the assessment specification on the website.
Thank you so much. There was at least one question on the feedback to candidates. Now I'm going to ask Lisa to come in, but my understanding, Lisa, is that candidates get quite detailed feedback on how they performed on SQE2. but less detailed feedback on SQE1. Am I right? And can you expand further on that, please?
Yeah, so with SQE2, we provide a complete breakdown of the marks so that candidate will see what they've done well in and what they've done less well in across each of the stations. For SQE1 at the moment, if we were to provide something equivalent, you would get 180 ones and zeros for each test. So obviously it's less useful. What would be fair to say is that we're always looking for ways that we can improve the feedback that we're providing. So yeah, I would hope that we'll be able to provide some more detailed feedback before too much longer.
Thanks, Lisa. And another one, I think, for you, probably, Lisa. It's a question that came in when you were talking about how candidates' performance varies by area of practice. And somebody suggested that perhaps it's not that candidates' performance is varying, but maybe examiners' expectations are different. Maybe examiners in one area are demanding a higher level of performance than that in others. Can you help answer that concern, please?
Yeah, so I think that that's probably a fair comment, that there are different expectations that will be based on the assessment material, but those expectations of the knowledge levels, the skills, and the standards in each area are always aligned to the day one standard, and we have a very reliable and robust standard setting method that means that harder content will have a lower standard applied to it, and easier content has a higher standard applied to it. All of that is aligned, let's say, to that level of day one competence that we aim for. So so the process that we go through is quite robust, and the variance that we see in the assessment, and part of my job and my team's job is to look at that and to try and see if there is anything that is of a concern that we would raise with the assessment board, and as we've seen nothing that's been unusual so far within any of the assessments that we've done for SQE.
Thanks, Lisa. Perhaps, Tim, you could take the next one. There's been a question about the proportion of SQE1 questions that address issues of law where the law is uncertain.
Yeah, I mean, we in the assessment specification, we set out the basis on which we assess, and certainly set out the law. So it's quite clear that we don't test on the development of the law. It's also quite clear that we have a cut-off date of 4 calendar months prior to the date of the first assessment in an assessment window, and that's what candidates will be tested on, the law that stands at that date. So the candidates can be quite certain as to what the law is going to be and what they're going to be tested on, even if after that cut-off date something changes, they've got certainty that we wouldn't be testing on that change.
Thanks, Tim. The next question, I'm not sure whether it came in before you addressed it, but I'm just going to ask you to revisit it. I think it goes to the heart of Angoff. So somebody has asked what the test for the difficulty of a question is, and the questioner points out that any question is difficult if you don't know the answer. So I think this probably takes us to Angoff, because my understanding is that's all about what a day one solicitor should know.
Yeah, that's right, and I'm sure Lisa might come in as well with any comments as well on Angoff. But as I mentioned, it's the Angoff panel that assesses the difficulty of the questions, and so the Angoff panel, I've talked about who would sit on the Angoff panel and how that's comprised. The Angoff panel then review the questions and without any input from the academic team, and they decide how many in their view, how many day one solicitors out of 10 would get that particular question correct. Then Lisa will take that data and develop that and be able to look at, give each score a standard or a score which goes to difficulty. Lisa, I don't know whether you've got anything else to add to that.
Yeah, so as said in the previous answer, it's part of the robust nature of what we do with the standard setting. What we want is a standard that at the end of the day we can stand by and demonstrate that those people who meet that standard are fit to practice and have that level of knowledge for a day one competency that we're kind of expecting. So all of the ANGOF work that we do, ANGOF is the person who developed the method. All of the ANGOF work we do is set ahead of the exam running, so it's all independently done, it's objective, and that provides a lot of validity and reliability that the standard that they provide us with very much looks at the standard of the day one competency and does not necessarily take into account the skill set of the people coming into the assessment. It's very much an assessment that looks forward at what people will go and do rather than looks backward at the group who are kind of taking the assessment. So very, very common, very highly regarded, and very robust, and it's the reason that we use it here.
Thanks, Lisa. And all of that is explained on the website, isn't it? And a lot of the information that we've been discussing this morning is, of course, included in the annual report, which I've said was published just last week. So if you want to know more, do go and have a look, and do look carefully at the slides that we've been through with you this morning. Just finally, some questions have come in about the experience that candidates have when they're seeking a reasonable adjustment. Kaplan have been seeking feedback from such candidates. In fact, I observed a focus group, I think it was the week before last, on this very topic. So we're always seeking to learn lessons on how to make that experience as good as it can be. So I can give you that assurance. I think we've probably covered all of the questions that have come through. Apologies if I've missed anything, but I hope you found the session helpful, informative, whether you're a candidate preparing yourself to take the assessments, a training provider supporting candidates to take the assessments, or a firm who's wanting to understand more about the experience that your employees will have, or your future recruits will be having if they're going through the SQE. Thank you so much for joining us. There is an opportunity to feedback on how you found today's event. If you're joining the session this afternoon, which is on qualifying work experience, you might want to wait until then. If you're popping off now, then please just take the opportunity to join the link and feedback. The session on qualifying work experience, facts, myths and tips will start at 1:30, and hope many of you will join us then. But it just remains for me to thank Tim, Lisa and Emma so much for joining us, for sharing their insights of SQE1 so far. I'm sure everybody found your contributions really useful. Thanks to everybody who's joined today. Thanks to everybody who's posed a question. A reminder, 1:30 for the session on qualifying work experience. Hope to see many of you then. Thanks. Bye all.